Now let's talk about the basics of creating geometry. So we're going to go over some of the things that we kind of already talked about, but we're going to try to do this a few different times just so we get used to how things work. So again, to create a primitive piece of geometry, we're going to go to the tool palette, which is located by default over here on the dock over to the right. Again, if it's closed, you can expand that out, or you can also, if it's not there, you can access it via Tool up in the menu. Okay, so we want to draw out a polygon, so we're going to go to the main tool icon here, and we're going to draw out a primitive shape. So this time, let's draw out a cylinder. Okay, now remember, we've selected the cylinder, but we haven't drawn it onto the canvas yet. We haven't added it to our scene. So let's click and drag it onto the canvas, and immediately we're going to hit the T key to go to edit mode. So there you can see edit mode is on. Now we can move around this thing. Okay, so right now this is a primitive, as we talked about, and primitives are not something that we can sculpt on. If I try to actually grab a brush here and begin sculpting, it's going to tell me that this is a primitive and we actually have to convert it to 3D object. But if we're using a primitive, it might be a good idea to change the shape of it to get a little bit closer to what we want before we actually start sculpting. So let's say we want kind of a base for our scene that we want to be much thinner than what it is now. We can come down here, and still in the tool palette, we're going to go to initialize, and this is where all of our settings are going to live for our primitive objects. Now you might see this and think that it looks a little bit odd. So right now we don't have perspective on, so we're looking at this from more of an orthographic view. So if we click this button over here to the right, perspective distortion, you can see P is the hotkey for that as well. That'll give us a little bit more of a realistic look at our cylinder. So you can see the difference here by just toggling between that. Okay, so we've got the alignment, so we can change alignment based on how we want this to be aligned. We'll align it in the Y. And then we have size values in the X, Y, and Z. So if we want this to be shorter, what would we do? Well, we would probably take one of these values down. Now in this case, we would think this would be the Y value, but it's actually going to be the Z value. So let me increase this back to 100. So if we take the Z value down, you can see it's shrinking the size down. We can also take the X value down if we want to have more of an oblong shape, or the Y, or all three. You can also create an inner radius if you want to do like a pipe. There's values for that. Okay. And we can also change the resolution. So you can see the facets of this here. We can't really see the rest of the geometry, so in order to be able to see that, we need to turn on our polyframe. Now it's hard to see down here, but there's actually a button called polyframe at the bottom of this vertical row here. But we can also go to transform, polyframe, it's going to look just like this, or we can hit Shift F to turn that on. So you can see this gives us an idea of the actual geometry that's going to be there when we convert. Now right now we have a bunch of lines going this way, so we can take our vertical divide and reduce that a little bit. Okay, so we can do maybe something like that, maybe 5 or 6. You can also add subdivisions along the cap. You can see the ratio will change how those subdivision lines are added based on our V divide. You can also change the divisions going around, so we can change the horizontal divisions. So by reducing those, it becomes more faceted, or if we increase them, it becomes smoother. So let's set this to 36 or so. We can also taper the top if we wanted to do that. So once you get the settings the way that you want, at this point you can convert that to a polygon object, which will enable all of your other sculpting tools and mesh, being able to use the Z modeler and things like that will happen if you convert this to a polymesh. So you can see right now it's just called Cylinder 3D. If we open up our subtool subpalette, which kind of shows us each piece of our model, we have the one Cylinder 3D. If we now go to Make Polymesh, that'll actually convert that to a polymesh. So now it adds that PM3D to the cylinder. We can still go back and select the initial cylinder. You can see here in our tools. Okay, so here's our polymesh cylinder. Then we have the basic cylinder that still has those initialized settings that we set. But with our polymesh cylinder, now we can come in and begin to use our sculpting tools on this. Okay, and so it's a little bit hard to tell there. You can see we can start doing any sort of sculpting that we want to on this. Or we can use the Z modeler to come in and do some low poly modeling on it as well. But it's basically, it's in a state where we can start subdividing it, we can start sculpting, and we can start working with it. Now, if you want to start with some existing assets, you can load in a Z tool here. You can also import an OBJ file. We can also go to Lightbox, and you can come in here, and this is just kind of a depository or repository of different kinds of assets. And so here you can have this is sort of a searchlight here. If we click on this, say no, I won't save changes. And that'll actually open up a new project, which is a little bit different than a Z tool, but it'll open up a new project where now we have this model, which has all of these different pieces, and you can come in and start to manipulate this. So your Lightbox is going to be a great way to bring in these different projects. You can also go just to open a different tool. There's different starting tools that you can work with, and you can just click and drag to find different options that you want to be able to use. Close that out. You can see here we have a sort of soldier. Okay, and if you just hit the comma, that will automatically open up Lightbox. So experiment with some of those existing assets. Make sure you're in edit mode, and you can kind of jump back and forth as you have those different things loaded. You can go back and click on these different ones over here in our tool palette. Okay, so play around with that a little bit, and then in the next lesson we'll talk a little bit more about how ZBrush works with files, what kind of files you can save out of ZBrush, and so on. So we'll go ahead and do that next.